a resident physician at the University of California, Davis Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, and is also currently a fellow of the American Psychiatric Association as part of the prestigious APA Foundation SAMHSA or SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program. Dr. Khan has previously served as the co-editor-in-chief of the UC Davis Health Student Review, and most recently as a senior fellow with the Council on American Islamic Relations, Sacramento Valley chapter. In 2016, Dr. Khan was recognized by President Barack Obama for his work in providing culturally competent care for underserved communities, which he continues through his work in leading a community-based mental health clinic at Shifa Community Clinic, tailored to meet the unique mental health needs of minority communities, as well as serving on the board of directors of Opening Doors, a local nonprofit organization serving refugee and victimized populations. With his research focusing on public health issues in minority populations, Dr. Khan has presented international as well as published in several academic journals and media outlets, including the Huffington Post. Dr. Khan has also holds a Bachelor's of Science in Psychobiology and a Master's of Public Health degree with an emphasis in healthcare policy and legislation. So thank you, Hammad, for joining us today. From your bio, I think folks can tell that you're no stranger to Sacramento. You're homegrown, as they say. So it's really a blessing to get the perspective of someone who is from here and is here, and to someone like that to be able to tell us how we can contribute to our society. So I'll get right into it. What was your experience, reality, growing up in the Sacramento Muslim community, and how has that shaped your outlook, your goals, your purpose, etc.? And I think you can infuse kind of like a self-introduction into this, just kind of speaking to that.
Sure. Assalamu everyone. It's an honor to be here. I was really excited to do this. I mean, when Osama reached out and getting a chance to spend some time with Osama and get to spend some time with him in kind of a formal setting, even something that I'm looking forward to. So I'm really glad to be here tonight and looking forward to having a good conversation. I think you've given me a far too generous introduction, and I don't know if there's anything I would add as opposed to just take away parts of it. But really, I think the biggest thing I can share is that, I grew up here. Sacramento is a place I've called home. It's a city that I've, known since I was, a little kid. And I've had the privilege and the honor and there's very gracious opportunity to continue my education, my medical training here, and continuing to work in this community. And thinking back, growing up in Sacramento, like many of us, I'm the product of immigrants. My family came over, from different parts of the world, and we settled in a community that was very new to us. To this day, we, like many fathers, my dad's one that's very stoic, one that's very reserved when it comes to his stories of first arriving in this country, and one that it takes a lot out of him to give us even some insight into the challenges and the difficulties that they went through when they first came over to this community. And growing up in that situation and growing up in, a household where, Islam was important from an early age. Culture was important from an early age. Language, religion, tradition, these things were very infused in our day-to-day lives. I remember having these early memories as a kid of being in the backseat of a car and having, maybe a conversation with my younger brother. And like many other immigrant mothers, my mom would look back and tell us that we needed to speak in Urdu, because if we didn't speak to our siblings in the family language, we were going to lose it. And I think in a lot of ways that encapsulated childhood in so many different ways, where we wanted to make sure that we held on to what was important. We wanted to make sure we held on to what was sacred. And we really wanted to hold those principles and values in hand. For me personally, I grew up going to the V Street Masjid downtown, the historic Sacramento Masjid that, everyone and anyone's familiar with. And I have these really strong, vivid memories of, the uncles and the rows, whether it's Jummah or Taraweeh. They're standing there, traditional shalwar kameez, iron, super bright and white, and just the pride and the strength that they were able to showcase in the traditional garb. And, those things don't really leave you, they stick with you. And I think thinking back of growing up in this community, I think that's a really strong theme that comes out, that this has always been a community that's been very strong, one that's been confident, and one that's been really proud of its identity. And I think that's really shaped me growing up in it.
Alhamdulillah. I think we've had the blessing and opportunity to showcase a wide array of speakers when it comes to their generational presence, right? A few weeks ago, we had the opportunity to talk to a speaker who only remembers V Street as the only masjid in Sacramento. And, you know, as the generations progress, like, you know, with my generation, I remember Sacramento being very diverse in terms of, you know, places of worship, in terms of the Muslim community, in terms of you know, religious background, etc. For you, like, how has it been, you know, just kind of growing up, seeing the community expand, you know, being, and I'm sure with your work at CARE, you know, you've been exposed to so many different parts of the Muslim community in Sacramento and across the San Joaquin Delta, and, you know, like, how is that, like, you know, how has it been experiencing that expansion?
It's been incredible. I mean, growing up, going to B Street, that's a, you know, a masjid in a community that can be somewhat homogenous at times. And, you know, kind of growing up in that environment and getting to learn Islam in that environment, and then in some ways, you know, moving into different circles in college and in the MSA at UC Davis, and, you know, working later on with CARE and, you know, Salam and the beautiful community that developed there over these last 2 decades. It's been eye-opening, because you begin to learn from everyone's experiences. You begin to learn the different flavors and, you know, cultures that live within the context of Islam and exist and celebrate it within this context. And for me as an individual, it's been incredibly enlightening. And to this day, I think it's so nice to be able to not only have my own sort of confident and very clear sense of identity when it comes to, you know, myself as a Muslim, as, you know, a Pakistani, as an American, but then also get to learn from my, you know, my friends from Afghanistan or from Morocco or Algeria or Saudi or wherever, and begin to really understand everything that everyone has to offer. I think that by far the biggest benefit and the biggest thing I'm excited about is the food scene. The halal food scene in Sacramento has been on the up and up from the days of McDonald's and cheese pizzas to being, you know, the incredible place that it is now.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. I'm still, like, you know, holding out on having a halal soul food place. Um, I was in Texas not too long ago, and their halal scene is like amazing. And we had halal brisket, and I probably, like, will not eat, you know, brisket again until I have it at that place, or at any place that's comparable. So, you know,
Yeah.
I definitely, like, appreciate that diversity as well, you know, with the Sacramento community, like, mashallah, it's as diverse as ever. Um, just to
And
shift gears a little. Oh,
on
sorry, go
that
ahead.
point though,
Yeah.
I think it's incredible when you think about that, right? Like we're seeing this like generational thing going on right now where initially cultures came over, you know, the Pakistanis needed to eat, so they opened up the naan and curry shop, and the Afghans needed to eat, and then, you know, they can get the rice and the kebabs going, and, you know, Arabs and shawarmas. And now we've gone to the point where it's like we're all going to each other cuisines. Like our parents are getting exposed to cuisines they never had, you know, when they lived overseas, maybe our grandparents even. And now we're beginning to see American food, you know, burgers and brisket and like all this stuff that, you know, are somewhat foreign to a lot of our communities. And now, in, you know, whether you're in Houston or Chicago or in New York and these places, like you're seeing this fusion. And in a lot of ways, I think maybe food is at the forefront of it, where we're able to do that and enjoy that. But really, I think it highlights our ability to assimilate and integrate in ways that could be incredibly effective. And I want us to come back to that same sort of topic later on. But I think, you know, when we think about like assimilation and when we're thinking about health and healing, I think it's a big part of that topic. And I think this is a really cool example of like, this is a way that it works well. And this is a way that like should give us some hope and optimism as to like how we can do this and how we can, you know, do this effectively.
Yeah, that's a beautiful reflection, because I think about that a lot. I think it's a testament to true community building. One of my teachers taught me that you'll know that communities are starting to build and get closer to one another when foods start to cross boundaries, right? When you see Desi folks eating, you know, soul food or Thai food, or, you know, whatnot, or you see Arab folks eating like spice levels that they're not, you know, well acquainted with, right? So you
Which means
start,
any spice at all, right?
yeah, which means anything beyond salt and pepper. So I think that's definitely like a, you know, a beautiful reflection on that. And I think it's, you know, it's beautiful to see that that's actually happening, you know, whereas early generations, like you said, earlier generations were so focused on maintaining and conserving the culture, that they brought with them, right? And now it's like, okay, I feel so comfortable and rooted in my culture here that I'm able to open up and start sharing with the world, right? So that's beautiful. Just to shift gears a little bit into your professional career, what's your trajectory looking like now? You know, what was the development of your academic and professional trajectory up until this point? And more importantly, as a young person, how has your faith played a role in your growth and your achievements?
It's been huge. I went to school here in Sacramento, product of, local schools, went to high school here in Carmichael and Jesuit. And I was in for culture shock when I showed up at UC Davis as an undergrad. Massive university, people from all over, Muslims from all over, even, communities I'd never been in contact with before. And the workload was hard. It was way harder than I thought it was going to be. School up until high school hadn't, it was challenging, but it was different. It felt more doable. And college was tough. There was classes that didn't go my way. There was grades that didn't, weren't anywhere close to where I wanted them to be. And I think particularly at those times, like faith came in incredibly important. I can't remember how many times I'd sit after a test and just try to remember, like, the insights and the lessons our parents and our elders and our community leaders have taught us, and like coming back to like these hadiths of like, there's good in when you fail. Like, we're blessed as believers. There's good in when you come up short because you learn patience, and there's good in when you get good because you got what you want. And excuse my paraphrasing that, but really just this ideal of like optimism and faith, and just believing in that there's something waiting for you, and you'll be able to get there if you do what your part is, and that's just trying hard and working at it. And what was really special in that circumstance in college, in specific, is the MSA there. I had never been around that many Muslims before. And for the first time in my life, there was like this network of people that came from shared sort of, faith backgrounds and somewhat shared cultural backgrounds. And I remember the older guys and some of the guys I looked up to, like, as big brothers, as mentors, like pushing forward, like, hey man, you're not at where you need to be. This is what you need to do to get there. So step up and like handle your business and get through what you need to do. And having, I think, that network and just that kind of that aspect of support and camaraderie and brotherhood and sisterhood, it was huge. And I think such a cool thing about what makes college in the United States such a unique experience. And in particular, I think the UCs, and particularly UC Davis, because I got to shout them out. That's a community that was awesome to go to school in. But kind of contextualizing that within like my narrative, right? So like I went to undergrad at Davis. Towards the end of towards my actually the beginning of my freshman year, I got involved with Shifa Clinic. Super early, I'm 6 months out of high school, not really sure what I'm doing, but like in the back of my head is like, hey, medicine sounds cool. I've been kind of sort of thinking about it for a long time. I'm not going to know if I want to do it or not until I like kind of throw myself into that world and try. And my dad, and like, something that he's always taught me is like, if you're going to do something, you got to do it all the way, right? You can't kind of be like, maybe, or like, maybe I'm pre-med, maybe I'm pre-law, maybe I'm just like trying to figure it out, and then not really make the progress that you need to make. So he was like, try out medicine, see if it's for you. And like, it was the coolest experience. I got really blessed that mentors like Dr. Yasmin and some of the other folks there were, they believed in me, they pushed me, and I just got lucky and I got the opportunity really early. And it got me involved in this whole new world that I was super excited about, and like immediately felt like this is what I wanted to do. This was something where I could go home at night and feel like the hours I put into my work today or my efforts today were like meaningful. And I remember very explicitly the story of like going into clinic one day. And it was like, we work on the weekends and folks are coming in, many who like don't have insurance and have access for other reasons. And she came in and we did some blood pressure checks and got her some medications. And the med students at the time, the doctors helped out. And then she came back like 3 or 4 hours later, and she brought back like a tray of sweets and like some tea. And it was like the most beautiful moment of like, wow, like I played a role in that. Like I'd made her day so much better in some small way that day, that she needed to express gratitude, or she felt like there was meaning and value in what I was doing. And it felt really cool to be a part of something like that, where you could generate that sense of goodwill and, really be able to make a difference in someone's life. And that was sort of, in a lot of ways, a cementing moment for me, where I was like, this is it. Like, this is really cool. And this is what I want to do.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think, I mean, there's a whole lot to unpack there. I think even just to start off at the whole, your reflection on the MSA, I think the the essence of being, you know, a young Muslim student at a college or university in the United States, you know, at its core is very identity oriented, right? And building, knowing that you can go somewhere to meet people with shared identity, right, is like just very empowering. I remember actually I was in high school. I think it was when you were at Davis, and I was like a, you know, a sophomore in high school, and I was like, yo, these guys are the coolest people ever, you know. It's like I like from a young age, and it's like now that I think back in retrospect, like from a young age, you have young Muslim men and women who look up to these students. And I like when I was at that stage, I was like, yo, I'm a nobody. Like, you know, when I was in college, I'm like, how could I have like, you know, had this super glorified image? And ultimately it's like that camaraderie, that brotherhood and sisterhood is something that we're just drawn to as Muslims, right? Like that's the core of building community. And then, you know, I think it's beautiful how you mentioned, you know, the sister who brought the sweets and the tea. Like you see that by circumstance. We have to understand that in in reality, like a lot of people do not have accessibility through whether it's insurance, whether it's like just in general funds, like through circumstance. You know, she went home, spent time, came back, and gave you something that, you know, if you scale it, you know, to some other person's, you know, cost, like standard of living, might have been more than like an insurance plan,
Yeah.
right? But just the meaning behind that is essentially like why these things matter,
Yeah.
right?
I
So
wanted to go back to what you were saying about like the college environment and like thinking about, you know, what that really meant. Because I feel like a lot of times we lose perspective too, right? And I remember Bassem was speaking to me about this once. And this idea of being a college age Muslim, a young 20s, 30, you know, early 30s, maybe even late teens, like age Muslim, and like post 9/11 America, right? The last 20 years of our lives in a lot of ways we show up to college as young adults, you know, 17, 18, and suddenly we are the voice of Islam, and we are the voice of like American Muslim identity for like, you know, our peers, our professors. Like I think we've all had that experience of being in like, you know, a poli sci class or a philosophy class or religious studies class, and your instructor who, you know, maybe from a different faith group or a different background looks to you to answer a question about Islam. And it's like, hey, I'm 17. Like, I have no formal training in this. And now I'm like the area expert. And in a lot of ways, I think it you know, accelerates development at that early age. Like when we're working on MSA boards and in committees and all these projects, like we're doing things and working at levels with, you know, institutional leaders and like, you know, state leaders and faith leaders in a way that most other college age people just aren't getting to do. And part of it's by necessity and part of it's by opportunity. But it really, at least for me, I feel like really accelerated my growth and my maturity, my learning, because it was kind of like you got to step up because someone needed to do the work, and we got put in places and got opportunities to be able to step up and do some of that work. And I think, you know, humble at the time it was challenging, but I think looking back at it, it was an incredible opportunity. I feel really blessed to have that time.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I don't even need to add on to that. I think that's just beautiful, beautifully put. And like on that note, you know, it shows that, you know, you as well as, you know, other Muslims that are put under these circumstances follow a somewhat modified trajectory, right, in their respective fields. And for you, it's the field of medicine, where you become well versed in public health, right, and participating in it, right, in a not so glorified way, right. There are people who get like top internships where, you know, they're, you know, they have access to all the resources, all the networks, all of the mentorship like resources that are afforded, you know, to people in that field. But take, for example, your experience with Shifa Clinic, right, which is a very like small time community clinic. Mashallah has grown exponentially since the beginning. You know, all thanks to Allah and, you know, the people who have been continuously uplifting the work. It's very necessary work, alhamdulillah. So how do you feel that this approach has contributed to your love of medicine in the unique ways that it's trained you?
I think it's about being in the trenches, and you know, once you see disparity face to face, Once you see people who don't have access in the way that you or your communities or people that you spend maybe your day to day with have access, it's you can't unsee it. I think in a lot of ways, it's like when you're traveling overseas and you see poverty for the first time and you see hunger for the first time. And when you come back into your local communities and you realize that, like, mashallah, you've been living a privileged lifestyle, where maybe you haven't had to see that face to face, be 5 minutes from where you live. Maybe you haven't walked through what a homeless shelter in Sacramento or in Stockton or in different parts of our state look like. You've never been to a food kitchen. You've never looked at, what a homeless encampment looks like. All these places where these are off the main road. We drive past them every day. We see people from these communities when we're walking through downtown or midtown, but we never interact with them. Our worlds don't collide. And I think for me, working at Shifa, working, now at UC Davis, working in community-oriented settings where many people don't have access to healthcare, people don't have access to basic necessities like housing, jobs, clothing, things that we all pretty much take for granted and like to assume don't, aren't real problems in our country and our neighborhoods. But when you see that face to face, you can't help but care. And I think that was part of what influenced my trajectory, thinking back, where health disparities was, the foundation of what we were working on at Shifa. We would show up in the morning at like 8 a.m. and or maybe 7 a.m. and there'd be a line of people that had started lining up at 5:30 or 6 a.m. that went from our door to the street. And these are families, these are older people, people that have been out in the cold or in the rain, and we'd have to turn them away because we wouldn't be able to see that many people in that day. And we didn't want them to have to wait, be turned away at the end of the day. So at the first thing in the morning, us as like 18, 19, 20-year-olds were not only dealing and seeing with disparities, but feeling the pain and the suffering, and seeing that face to face. And I think that really drove me into wanting to be in a field of medicine, now being in mental health and also working a lot in public health. Think, in a place where I knew that disparities are huge. These are things that our communities are impacted by. And there's a lot of room to make a difference. And like alhamdulillah, I've been blessed to work at an institution that's supportive of those goals. But there's a ton of work to be done.
Sure. I had a question about, what, I guess, myths. I usually ask folks, what are some myths that are prevalent about your field that, that you want to be debunked? But it seemed like, to be honest, your answer right there was really encompassing, right? It really shows that it's not about the money, right? It's not about the status. Like when you see these disparities, you can't help but feel empathy for those who are going through it and understanding your place of privilege, right? No matter where you come from, no matter who's affected, around you in your immediate circles, like you empathize with the struggles, and understanding that no matter how many similarities you draw between your struggles and others, like they have their own unique realities, that exist for them.
I
So
was
as
talking
Muslim,
to. I'm going to touch on just briefly touch on what you were asking, almost about like the financial aspect of it, right? I was having a really interesting conversation with a couple of friends these last couple of days, and in the context of the election and feeling disenfranchised and feeling like what room do we have in this country where it feels like nearly half of our country is against us, whether thinking about racism or Islamophobia or so on and so forth. And one of the guys made this comment about one of the things our parents' generations and some of our elder generations came into this country with was sort of this survival mentality, right? Like you have to come here and just got to get by. And then as long as you can get by, you've made it. And I think because of their hard work and sacrifices and what they put in, they've given us the opportunity to build upon that, right? So when their generation pushes us towards, maybe these higher earning careers or higher status, quote unquote, careers and things like that, really it's not a question of like, are you going to go make money or not? Yes, you'll make money being a doctor. You'll also make money being an engineer or a business owner or a lawyer or in the arts and whatever it is that you're passionate about, can really put in the work and are talented at. But it's also about, what do you do then? And I think that's the part where I think we really need to start thinking more and more about, if we are in these lines of work, if we are in these areas where we have some privilege, some power, and our voice is heard, what are you going to do with your voice? Are you going to sit there and grab a couple of checks and drive a nice car, or are you going to do something meaningful, impactful? And I think that's the real challenge that we, particularly within those of us and within healthcare, are faced with right now, because the disparity is there, the opportunity to speak of it, do something about it, it is there. But now it's a matter of like, either you step up and you do it, or you keep ignoring it. And I think that's hard to do, for me at least.
Yeah, I talk to my siblings and other young people about this all the time, that intergenerational gap where, our parents and grandparents, or how, our elders in general within the context of the community, had to get by and survive, right? They're they're wired in a way that automatically goes to, survival when they're interacting with someone. And we see that in the way we interact with the status quo, right, with different institutions versus how they interact with those institutions, right? They may be a little more passive, whereas we're a lot more radical in that sense, right? We're a lot more, we challenge, like, and we're, outspoken about it, right? But I often tell them, like, you don't understand an issue or a problem unless you delve into the foundations that that reaction or that interaction was built upon, right? It's easy to write something off by saying, like, oh, they just don't know, or oh, it's just a different time, right? But understanding that even you being able to challenge that thing is because they were able to build those relationships and compromise things that they may have not felt comfortable with,
Right.
right? And we have to understand that, and without understanding that, right, we're not able to truly build and connect that, generational gap, right? And continue on, like, what's going to happen when future generations come and they start to think about us that way, right? Like, we really have to think about that. There's a beautiful tradition in Native American tradition where they think before they make any decision, right? They think 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind, right?
So
They think about, what did the 7 generations behind me do, right? And how will this affect the 7 generations ahead of me? That's before making one decision. And nowadays we're out here making what we think is the best decision because, oh, we have conflated egos or whatnot. And I remind myself first, sometimes we all act out
totally.
of passion or, whatnot. But this is a really beautiful reflection that I've learned, like, from other, communities that we can employ. And this is in our tradition. It's not something that's, like, foreign to us, right? This is in our tradition. So I think that's a beautiful thing. And,
That's
you
huge.
know, yeah. So kind of on that note, right, as Muslims were taught, right, this concept of amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, enjoining what is good and forbidding what is evil. And I think medicine, you know, exclusively is one of the most, right, uncontested fields, or one of the fields where this concept is, like, the most uncontested, because
Right.
how could you have, you know, the opportunity to do evil or whatnot? We know now that corporations are involved and whatnot. We'll leave that to the side. But, as someone who wants to be a doctor, someone who wants to help people in the field of medicine, like, this is the foundation. Like, you want to enjoin what is good, right? So how can people that are pursuing medicine, right, and people who are in medicine take it one step further to establish this concept, right?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think it's important because, with, like you're saying, within the context of medicine, like there's like this sense of not only that you're trying to do good, do no harm, help thy patient, all these, like, maxims and important parts of what we do, but there's also this sense of arrogance of, we can do no harm. We're out here doing God's work. We have, just the ability to heal, and somehow that's empowering and also somewhat, freeing of, maybe responsibility or the additional weight of more, like, things to take into account. And I think it's important for those of us within healthcare to, like, check ourselves and to be very cognizant of the realities, recognizing that, even for me as a Muslim physician, if I'm serving a Muslim patient, my experience is different than him or her sometimes. And just because we share some element of culture doesn't mean our experience is identical. But, moving past that, and I think really for people that are in training or thinking about going into this field, one thing I always like to bring up, particularly for students, is thinking about, what are the communities that you're representing when you come into this field, or really in any professional field. And when you think about healing and community healing and identity and those things, how they interact together within marginalized groups in this country, for generations now, we've seen, communities of color, other stigmatized communities, immigrant groups, and they get told this message over and over again. Assimilation is, like, goal one, and that's how you reach success. We tell people who have pigment in their skin that it needs to be lighter. We tell people whose hair is, naturally wavy, that it needs to be straighter. We tell women in the workplace, to succeed, you have to be more like men. And the implicit messaging you're sending out is that what you have is insufficient. What you are is somehow lacking. Your hair is not straight enough, your skin is not light enough, something about your gender, is somehow defining you in a negative light. There's something wrong with you. And I think that's something that we really need to begin to work on fighting within our communities, within ourselves, our families, and our, our, even our mushroom communities, so that when we do go into these fields and we're positioned in a place where we can make a difference for our patients, make a difference for our communities, we're able to do so knowing that we're there to represent, those from we come. Right, we represent the, if I grew up in the much of the environment where we worship our communities and we went every, week doing that in traditional garb and, and living that lifestyle and that culture, then part of the reason I'm here is because of that community shaping me. And I need to be able to do my work and educate myself and understand the issues that they face because I'm the closest thing to the voice that they might have at that next table. And I think the moment we start doing that work is the moment that we can really, enjoin in the good and forbid what is evil, that we could really do that thing that we want to do as healers, as providers in our communities. Because if we let that gap erase itself, or we let it wash away as we kind of progress forward in our careers, then we're doing a huge disservice. And I think that's one of the big fears I have for myself as an individual and us as like a generation in some ways, that as we continue to move through our professional and corporate and healthcare, what have you type of careers, that gap becomes a little, wider, that connection becomes a little weaker, and that we're losing, what it is that brought us there in the first place. And I think it's so critical for us to hold on to.
Yeah, on that note, it's a perfect transition. What is community-oriented medicine? You touched on it a little bit. You touched on that representation, right? You touched on that familiarity with the people, like the people who are serving you, the people you're going to for help. Like what is it, and why is it more important now than ever in Sacramento in particular?
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing I like to touch on that topic is like this. There's this concept within healthcare of cultural competency, right? And you hear about it across, like, outside of medicine too. And the idea is like, as a professional entity, you need to reach certain competencies, whether they're, in different realms of workplace or whatnot. And I think it's inherently flawed, where there's no amount of like, classes or webinars or talks that you can go to where you're suddenly like, you're able to check all the right boxes and now I am competent, right? Like, I'm Hammad, I did a 10-hour training, I am now competent. It inherently makes no sense. And I think what you need to root yourself in when you're thinking about like community medicine and community healing is the concept of cultural humility, that I'm Hammad, I have some understanding, but I'm here to learn from you. And I'm going to try my best to be as sensitive and as open to, your experience and your reality. I'm probably going to screw up and I'm going to come up short. And that might mean not understanding, where you come from. It might mean me being, someone who jumps off of a stereotype. I might use the wrong pronoun. I might make an assumption about you that isn't true. But I need to be humble enough to recognize that as something that could be holding me back in how I'm providing you care, or how I'm trying to design a system that might be able to best serve you.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. I think we find ourselves trying to check off boxes a lot more than we are just trying to understand the moments that we're in. I guess,
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, thinking about Sacramento though, like, our community is so dynamic, right? We've had like this huge influx of like, immigrants coming in over the last few decades. And now over this last decade, like we've seen like all these refugees, families, and folks coming in that are brand new to our country, right? And I think what's important for us to think about now is like, we need to bring the histories and like particularly the traumas of our communities into our lexicon. Like we need to be thinking about this at an education level. We talk about, World War II had this impact, the depression in this country had a big impact, Vietnam had this impact in our communities. Often when I'm working in the hospital setting, I'm seeing folks that are, Vietnam vets that are unfortunately, maybe homeless or lacking security or lacking some kind of housing situation where they can be safe. And we talk about the role of the military and the world in their lives and their trajectories. We need to bring that conversation to the point where we talk about partition, Nakba, the Algerian Revolution, the Syrian war, the war on terror, the violence that we've seen over these last few decades, because now that violence that happened hundreds of miles away is here in Sacramento. The impact of it is going to be felt in our communities. And, as someone that's working, rarely does a weekend go by where if I'm in a hospital working in the emergency department or inpatient setting, I see people who live through these traumas and they're dealing with the effects of it. Whether that's, shelter and insecurity in regards to that, whether it's, job issues where they're not able to hold a steady job because of various, trauma driven factors and socioeconomic factors, whether it's substance use. We were talking about like MSAs before. And I was looking at this a few weeks ago. They did a survey at MSA West, and you're probably already aware of it, but they looked at people who'd gone to MSA West, so conference, Muslim students, college age for the most part, and it showed that I think 10% were using weed within the last year, and I think 7% or so were reported drinking alcohol over the last year. And those numbers are like, humble, they're much lower than the rest of the population, right? But they're still there. And these are very small subsections of our community. So if we were to extrapolate from that data, you know, the numbers of people that go to our masajid, that go to our community, and even those who are maybe not present, as regularly, we're dealing with a lot of the same issues. And we need to be able to understand the context in which these issues arise. And that means, thinking about this from a critical lens, educating ourselves, and introducing the histories and cultures and realities of trauma that people are living into our our formal education system. And I think that's a big push that we should all be thinking about and working on.
Yeah, I think one thing that caused me to think about, specifically when it comes to the refugee, population within Sacramento, is that I find myself, because I am involved in, at least providing some sort of service through my work with care, just by nature of the job, and seeing one observation I've had is that intergenerational perspective that we just talked about, where one group was focused on assimilation, and that opened up the doors for our generation to focus on the empathy and the unapologetic existence and the acknowledgement of trauma and this and that. So I see that a lot of the time when some folks that may have been here longer were forced to quote unquote assimilate or integrate or whatnot, see people who are suffering from trauma, who are who have many obstacles and roadblocks within their lives and their families' lives, and then their response is, oh, I survived that, I was able to integrate regardless, or I was able to assimilate despite my trauma or the things that held me back, right? I'm kind of, I don't want to say disheartened, but I kind of foresee the challenge there, because when we're dealing with the quote unquote outside, again, because these new immigrants, right, or refugees, are represented by folks like us who have grown up here, right, and folks from different departments and institutions will come to us and ask us, hey, what do you think in terms of services? How can we assist? Right? Sometimes the answer that they get is like, oh, like, they're just panhandling, right? They're just looking for handouts, right? When in reality, like, we're bringing people here by circumstance, not by choice. No one wants to come here, right? It's just by circumstance, right? By result of our foreign policy, right? So it's kind of disheartening to see that there's this split, and you kind of spoke to it, where we need to have this deep institutionalization and education, regarding this. So it's, I guess my question is there some sort of outlook or remedy for this, right? For, I guess, folks who are thinking more, rehabilitative, right? Trauma oriented, like empathetic, right? And how to kind of, not just challenge this, but help bridge that understanding or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think it starts with what you're highlighting right now, and what you're modeling in a lot of ways, right? So approaching this from a critical lens, where you're thinking not only about where things are at, but why they got there. Like, you're thinking upstream, and then once you start thinking about why they got there, you kind of create this wider sort of circumstance of what are the systems in place? What is the pathway of foreign policy that led to people arriving in this country? What are the systems that exist when they got here, and where did they fall short? And what was different for me in my journey, maybe? I came to this country, X amount of years ago, and I pulled I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. I worked hard and I made it. But, that means that so and so didn't do it. Therefore, they, are lacking in some way. And I think, like you're saying, that misses the mark entirely, because what it does is that in a lot of ways it highlights that same need for cultural humility, and to recognize that just because you share certain traits with a second person, you're both Muslim, you're both the people of color, you're both immigrants, what have you, doesn't mean that you understand their experience, doesn't mean that you know their lives or their challenges or their struggles. In many ways, when I was talking earlier about this idea of like we need to introduce things like talking about partition and Nakba and these things into like our education system, we also need to educate ourselves. Most of us, when we think about what we know about, it's a very narrow lens. We know something, maybe if we're coming from immigrant families, we know about our country's history. Yeah, I can tell you a lot more about the history of Pakistan and partition than I probably could about Afghanistan over the last 6 decades, right? And that's part of the problem. And the biggest step is both, recognizing and admitting that and saying, hey, I am not knowledgeable about every happening in every part of the world. And just by, being someone from a certain background doesn't give me the right to speak to someone else's experiences. And secondly, it's also interesting because when you think about it from, a storyteller's perspective, every immigrant family or family member you talk to will tell you about that one nice person that he was like in the country early on, and like, alhamdulillah, that person was a blessing, they stepped up for me, they helped me out. Maybe it was an institution or a community. And I think that's really where we're at right now, as a community, as like people, and from our generation who've lived here our whole lives, who've grown up in this country, who've done our schooling and training in it. It's our time to step up. It's our time to be like, quote unquote, that uncle that helped out when someone was new to this country. It's our time to step up and be part of that institution that was able to provide that support. And alhamdulillah, like we've been blessed with more opportunity, in terms of our professional lives, our financial, socioeconomic situations, where we can do a lot more. We can help build institutions, we can help build organizations, we can help develop and do things like go get a state grant and work on projects that are important in a way that 20, 30, 40 years ago was incredibly more difficult. And what's really important when it comes to that is, I think when a community takes ownership, on this work, when a community takes ownership on their journey and their narrative, that stuff outlives funding. Like it doesn't, like, money stops mattering when the community is engaged, because you'll figure out how to make it work. If 30, 40 years ago we could get the money together and the efforts together to build these beautiful masajid, we can do the work now to fill them. We can do the work now to make the newcomers to our communities feel like they're places they can be safe and secure, both within our, our community centers and our masajid, and also in the community when they're out in the parks, the restaurants, trying to integrate into society and make this place home. And I think as people who are blessed with the opportunity and maybe happen to get here, a few decades earlier, it's on us to try to do our part. Because if not us, then who?
Mm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't know even what to add on to that. I think that's something that we should all really just think about. Um, I think before we make any decision, I think a lot of us face that dilemma where, we think about, okay, where do I stop giving, or, how much is enough giving, right? But ultimately it's like, there isn't enough, your existence should just be, the Prophet ﷺ said it, he said the hand that is above is better than the hand that is below. And that's, encouraging that, encouraging us to give, right? To always be that hand that gives, right? Because as soon as you stop giving, you're just consuming, right? So, mashallah. And, we're starting to run out of time, and I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So my final question to you is, what parting advice do you have? And this is a two-part question, both in terms of organizations that folks can support, as well as, what can we do ourselves to support, the most disadvantaged community members through supporting culturally competent community-oriented medicine, whether that is, in terms of services or in terms of organizations that are present.
Yeah, to answer maybe your second question first, in terms of like community-oriented medicine and like culturally competent care and culturally humility-driven care, I think it's one, thinking about like if you're going into one of these lines of work and you're interested in like being in a pre-med or pre-dental or pre-healthcare professional type of track, that you're not only focused on your studies and from an academic lens, but you're also remembering the community that you came from. I loved what you shared earlier about the Native American communities and indigenous people of this country sharing with us those lessons of, looking back generations, 7 generations back, 7 generations forward, or, really beginning to think about things across like a broader spectrum, and also thinking about the communities with which we come and how those can be a part of like our not only our narrative as we grow, but also in what we do and what we produce as professionals and, in the later parts of our careers. And then I think bringing that back into, our local context here, I think we've touched on a lot of these organizations, and like I'm going to speak the most highly of the ones I've had the privilege of being involved in. But Shifa Clinics doing amazing work in the community, providing care to people who are underserved and needing of services and healthcare in a very, very strategic and thoughtful sort of way. Care is in the forefront of civil rights work and making sure that our rights are respected, people are safe, people are treated fairly, that our education system is just and right in what it's doing, and that we're thinking about our future and planning for it in a way that's beneficial for our community, not only today but for decades and generations to come. And I think most importantly, honestly, I think the place that we should all be looking at is our own professional lives. And regardless of what field you're in, the concept of community medicine, I take that further and say community healing. And where that really comes into play is everywhere, in your workplace, in your, in your communities that you're a part of, the massager that you go to, the families that you're a part of. Start thinking about the same concepts. Start thinking about things like, humility and, our interactions and understandings of each other, and also humility in our sense of how we serve each other. There's things that we can do with any line of work that, push forward the narratives and the values that our communities are, waiting for someone to work on. And I think that that's something I felt very empowered doing within the context of medicine. And I think that's something that we can all take into our own professional lives and our, our personal lives and push forward too.
Jazakallah khair. We have a couple questions from the audience. First one is, have you ever had a negative interaction with a non-Muslim patient?
Yeah, I mean, I think going through training, there's always challenges, right? And I think particularly when you're a person of color, when you're someone who's maybe somewhat more visibly Muslim at times, there's always a sense of microaggressions that plays into it too. And that could probably be a long conversation on its own right. But really, one of the things to think about is for students in this country, and even more so when we think about like our African American brothers and sisters and Latino brothers and sisters, and folks from all across our minority communities especially, are experiencing this in education and training at all levels, where microaggression is such a huge part of what's happening. And for those of us who aren't as familiar with the term, I would strongly recommend like Wikipedia search that, learn more about it. But the basic idea is you're in a situation where something happens, and you kind of get lost in this thought process of, did my identity, did something about me cause that to happen? And it kind of builds upon itself, where something very small can have such a big impact. And I think for me, being in medical training, in this local community, yeah, the answer is undoubtedly. There's been times where there's been microaggressions. I can, definitely speak to times where people in higher levels of power in my training, higher level physicians or other healthcare providers, would speak in a way about Muslim patients, even in a way that was derogatory, or in a way that was in some ways playing on stereotypes and tropes and things of that regard. And you would see it on the other end, where there were certain patients that would make certain comments or speak in a certain way to you, and it was because of either an element of your skin tone or your faith or your name that they're seeing on your badge. Now, I speak as someone as privileged in the regard that I'm a male. I'm someone who wasn't as targeted for other reasons. I have friends who wear the hijab and are in medical professions, and the sisters often have it a lot worse. And I think each of us have interacted with people in that way and had to deal with it. But I think it's also something that all of us are seeing as society at large too, and we're continuing to learn how to grow with it and learn and push back when we can, and also empower our identity and our students and our young people to be able to be ready for that.
So our next question is, I'm guessing it's asking, what do you think is the next level for Shifa Clinic?
It's a beautiful question. There's a whole team of people that are taking that question and really working on it really hard. Led by Dr. Yasmin, whose leadership we've seen Shifa grow over this last few decades now, and we're continuing to see it grow over these last couple of years. We've added on things like a brand new dental clinic, where people are able to get dental services. We add on things like, we have a legal clinic where people are coming in to get a lawyer to work with them on different issues. I've been, blessed to have the opportunity to work with a team to start up a mental health clinic where we're providing direct psychiatric care or psychological care to people that are coming in for at no cost to them. And now as we look ahead, I think it's really important for us to take these works that are, being done and make sure that they're sustainable. And that not only means building up a line of people that are able to continue to serve and volunteer and provide this, but to also create institutions that are lasting, that are integrated within society at large. I think a big goal of, and I can't speak on behalf of Shifa as a whole, but for me personally, and I know a lot of us who are involved in these efforts, is to build an FQHC clinic, a federally qualified health center where we take advantage of the opportunity that the government is providing, and they're able to get funding and opportunity to build, these things in local communities. And we've seen different parts of our community. There's the Native American Health Center and other groups across the country, and even here in Sacramento, that use these, these funding sources to build, institutions that can serve specific communities and also the greater community at large. And I think as a Muslim community, particularly now that we have a big number of refugee patients coming in and folks that are going to continue to need care and already are, in need of care that's culturally competent and tailored to, their unique needs, it's on us to hopefully build that for them. We've seen that in Southern California, Oma Clinic in LA. Shout out to Adel down there. Their CEO is doing amazing things. Also, UC Davis product and a Care Sacramento alum as well. They're doing amazing work. And I think the next step for Sacramento is starting to think about bringing institutions like that into our community here.
Yeah, mashallah, I think that's definitely the next step. Adel is one of those guys. Again, when I was young, before like my high school kind of obsession with MSA, like when I was in middle school, like, Adel was one of those guys you see doing great work, at the college level, and then mashallah, you see where it takes him. I think these institutions are definitely necessary. We focus a lot on our spiritual institutions, which are very important. Those are, I think, the core of our existence as a community, but we need to build institutions to support our other aspects of our daily life as well. And I think that's the next level from the Muslim community in America. Like, I definitely agree with you. All right, I think we're out of time for today, Hammad. I really appreciate your time, bro. It's always an honor to talk with you. It was a little bit more formal of a conversation today. I really hope that everyone who tuned in on Zoom, Jazakallah khair for tuning in on Zoom, and those who tuned in on Facebook and YouTube, I really hope you benefited from this conversation, and that you took something away from it to help push forward this concept of cultural humility when it comes to services in our community. So without with that, inshallah, again, join us next week for our next hidden gem. This time I won't announce it early. I'll keep the suspense until early next week when we release our flyer, inshallah. Please look out for that. And we look forward to your continuous support. Jazakallah khair, for those of you who have been supporting us up until this point. So I'll close this out with the dua really quickly. Subhanallah Allahumma wa bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, Hammad.